Just in terms of the percentage of the population who might be affected, modelling estimates are rather broad, but they do extend, to half the population or more. So there is absolutely the potential for millions of Victorians to become infected, which means, potentially hundreds of thousands per day at the peak of this epidemic. So we have to plan around that, and we have to make assumptions that includes that scenario.
When you look at two sets of modelling, one is how many ventilators and so on we may be able to get online at any one time. And when you look at the other set of modelling, how many people may need them at any one set of time, how do they correspond?
It does depend on which scenario you pick amongst all the model scenarios. If it goes to a milder scenario, then it's within capacity. But at the worst case scenario, it goes beyond existing capacity or capacity that's coming online. That's happened in Italy. It's happening already in places across Europe and in the United States. So we have to accept that in a worst case scenario that it can exceed capacity. What the Minister has emphasised is that that is not set, because those models also build in how well we're complying with everything. If we can isolate people and they stay isolated, if we can quarantine those close contacts and they all quarantine, we can absolutely change that, even that worst case modelling scenario. So we don't have to, we don't have to be subject to that fate.
Brett, can I just ask, have you made any changes in your health advice to activities or gatherings or anything like that in the last 24 hours since we checked in with the Premier yesterday? Checked in with you yesterday?
No, we're meeting again as Chief Health Officers with the Chief Medical Officer. National Cabinet's meeting again today. All of this is reviewed on a daily basis. But as I've said, irrespective of the public health directions that might be given, people can and should do the right thing right now. And in a sense, this is a perfect virus because people don't change their behaviours until they can see a disaster unfolding. But when they see a disaster unfolding, it's too late to change your behaviour. And so we are absolutely urging everyone to do the right thing now to make a difference a month or more from now.
Why should big workplaces be open? I've heard of construction sites where there's a 500-seat lunchroom. Should they be shut down for the good of Victorians?
Well, we've talked about what the requirements are for indoor spaces, and indoor spaces shouldn't have more than 100 people gathering. And if they are 100 or fewer people, they still need to apply that density requirement. That's in the public health direction, and people need to be following that. We've also urged everyone who doesn't need to be face-to-face in a workplace or physically located in a workplace to work remotely. All of those things will make a difference and should be put into place now.
Should manufacturing shut down?
There is obviously manufacturing and non-essential manufacturing. That's also for HPPC and National Cabinet to consider, including today.
What else is on the agenda there? Is there other things?
Look, all of the potential non-essential and essential services are up for consideration. There's obviously a view that essential services need to continue, but everything else is for consideration by National Cabinet.
And for the Premier foreshadowed, he called it stage 1 yesterday in terms of shutdown of services and stuff in the city, and right now it's a ghost town. I don't know if you've been out there yourself, but what is stage 2, I guess? What levers can the government pull?
Well, I don't want to preempt the decisions around that, but
sure, you give advice to him though, don't you? Yeah.
We give advice to National Cabinet as AHPPC, and yes, there are some other non-essential services that might be for consideration, but I don't want to speculate on them.
So we can't get any clarification about what stage 2 means?
No, you'll hear about stage 2 when National Cabinet have made a decision and everyone's following that.
Is it the case that stage 2 is not defined? We just don't know. You just don't know yet because it's so unprecedented.
In many respects, it is unprecedented. We have to consider what the epidemic is doing from day to day, what the main things that might drive a change in transmission. But I should emphasise again that our individual behaviours are one of those key drivers. And so it's one thing to talk about the services that are open or not open, but it's another thing to talk about everything that each individual can do starting now.
Have you been happy with what you've been seeing on the streets?
To some degree, but as I say, I think there are people who haven't changed their behaviours because they can't see this unfolding yet. And when it does, and I'm hoping that we can change that, when it does, it's too late. And so people shouldn't think that because everything looks normal and our health services aren't feeling the pressure significantly yet, that they don't need to change anything. They need to change everything now.
How does the trajectory indicate to you whether this is becoming moderate, severe, less severe?
Look, we're really at the early stage, and so I think we need to use this opportunity now to make a difference, because it's not playing out in any particular direction other than following an epidemic curve that makes me uncomfortable. We need to flatten it. At the moment, it's increasing by 50, 60 a day, and we're getting new record daily figures. I don't want to see that. I want to see it stabilising and then going down.
In terms of people socialising in the home, we're getting a lot of questions from parents about whether they should be kissing their kids at home. Like, should we be social distancing in the home?
For suspected cases, so people who've been tested and who are awaiting a result, people who've confirmed cases, and for people who are close contacts, they do need to absolutely distance, including from their own families. And there's advice on our landing page around that. We need to make it more prominent, to make it more clear. We need to give some detailed directions because they're critical actions. For people who are well and who haven't really socialised with other people, if your kids don't have colds, if you don't have colds, and you haven't really been in touch with other people who have colds, the risk is going to be less. And, you know, it's clearly important to have the love and affection of our close family members. I don't want people to be in a state where they're psychologically being challenged by being socially isolated. We are talking about physical distancing, not social isolation.
We've spoken a lot about children being asymptomatic and then having mild disease. Are you able to let us know the condition of the preschool age child is, whether they were sick, what kind of symptoms they were posing, and if they, I guess, transmitted the disease to somebody else?
I won't speak to the individual case because privacy is a matter of a priority for us to keep it. But in general terms, children can have much more mild symptoms, and there's a percentage of them that probably are asymptomatic or have no symptoms. So on the positive side, we can feel that our kids are relatively safe from significant illness. By the same token, they can transmit with very minimal or no symptoms at all.
The Premier yesterday
Child,
spoke.
were they in contact with a confirmed case of coronavirus? Is it a family member who travelled overseas recently?
I don't have the details for that child.
In terms of the equipment that Victoria has on order, when are we expecting that to arrive, and is there a chance that because of worldwide demand we just won't end up getting access to that in time?
There's no real clusters in the sense of a chain of transmission amongst a really large group of people. There are some areas that are hotter spots than other areas that, you know, does relate. Well, the National Department of Health website will have some maps for all states and territories of Australia where you can reference those.
Are they putting them out?
They are putting them out.
Okay. Are you able to talk to the Victoria? Where is Victoria?
No.
Right. Okay.
But it largely relates to where people might have travelled internationally and the tendency of people to travel internationally as to where those hotter areas are. But they don't relate to clusters of related people. It is about the numbers of people in those suburbs, that's all.
We've consistently heard from, you know, the Prime Minister or Premier Daniel Andrews saying if schools need to be shut down, for example, it'll be for 6 months. Are you able to sort of explain what the 6 months, why 6 months is? Like, is it an arbitrary figure or?
Look, it is an arbitrary figure to a degree. I think we're trying to say to people that this is not going to be over in a week, it's not going to be over in a month or in 2 months. The more that we can get on top of this, actually the longer that it will go, because when you flatten the curve, you save our health systems from being overwhelmed, but you extend the period of time when those cases will occur. Ultimately, that's a good thing. That means that our health services aren't overwhelmed for a really significant period of time. But it it does mean that we need to have consideration of social distancing or physical distancing for months from now. The tail end of this, we don't know what it'll look like yet. The better we do, the longer it might become. But that's important because that will save lives and that will save our health services from being overwhelmed.
In China, for example, schools have started to reopen and it hasn't been 6 months since the first outbreak, obviously. So are you able to explain, why that might be the case in China and possibly Victoria?
So for China, outside of Hubei province, where Wuhan was the epicentre of that outbreak, they had thousands of cases, but they drove them down to zero, to the point where they had no transmission across China outside of Hubei province. And so they're lifting those restrictions now because they've got effectively zero cases other than a few returning Chinese nationals. When you've got no cases, you can and should start to look at lifting some of those restrictions. If Victoria, Australia is fortunate enough to be able to drive cases down to a point where we've really overcome this epidemic, then we can look at lifting some of those restrictions.
And how did they overcome the epidemic and how will we?
They overcame it with some extraordinary and really draconian measures. They were clearly isolating everyone to their home. They were shutting every non-essential service. They were following every close contact to the fullest extent possible, and people were effectively locked in their homes for weeks on end. That can happen in China. It's not clear if that could happen elsewhere in the world. And they are left with a dilemma. They've got millions of people who remain susceptible to the virus. And so there are those returning nationals now and other tourists potentially entering China who could introduce the virus, and they've still got all of the potential for an epidemic. So we have to bear that in mind, and we have to consider lifting the kind of physical distancing measures at a point where we're on the other side of this.
Have you been looking at the border, Dr. Sutton? Just in terms of, obviously, the Minister talked about Mildura, but there's also been some talk at Albury-Wodonga as well, because I think the Premier said yesterday the hospital in Albury is actually run by Victoria. So what would happen there? And like other states have shut borders. What's Victoria looking at?
Sure.
Yeah. So the Premier's made it clear that Victoria is not interested in
Testing. If there's an opening up into, you talked about how most of the cases are related in your hotspots to overseas travel. If you're opening up testing slightly wider, are you concerned that you will find that there is much more community transmission, or do you think there's more community transmission than is actually being picked up already?
Victoria's already moved ahead of the national case definition for testing. We've already opened it up more broadly to pick up those who haven't travelled, and that broader definition of patients in hospital. But I think the highest risk has been and still is return travellers. There are rates of positive tests up to 14-15% in Europe already. So we're seeing below 1%. Amongst those who haven't travelled, I think it's probably still below 1%. And for those who haven't travelled, that's what we're seeing. But there will be more transmission that we haven't picked up because there are lots and lots of people with mild disease, and that's why we have to urge people to remain isolated whether or not they're being tested, because we can't test the hundreds of thousands of people who will have runny noses on any one day.
So how significant do you think the undetected disease is?
It's very hard to say. The fact that we're picking up fewer than 1% means that it's going to be less than 1% across the board. But, we're a big city. It means that there are potentially hundreds of people out there who haven't got the diagnosis formally, but who might be unwell and who need to isolate for that reason. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.